recording here. Very good. It's pulsing. So we begin as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for this new day of grace that you give us to live in your divine will. I want to mark the fact that today is Holy Saturday of 2020. And for Christendom and the whole world, we are basically under lockdown because of the pandemic of the coronavirus, which is extremely symbolic, Lord. And we're going to try to explore some of those symbols this morning in this session on bioethical issues, the Masters in Bioethics at St. Thomas University with the current cohort of students. And we want to note, first of all, that on this Holy Saturday, yes, we're breaking the silence, the solemn silence that is promoted from the end of the Passion, the narrative of the Passion and veneration of the cross yesterday on Good Friday afternoon until the Easter Vigil tonight. But you know, Lord, in our hearts, it's for a good cause. It's because these are extraordinary times, and we just feel a strong need to share with one another right now, particularly since we are exploring bioethical issues in humanity, and even more strikingly, that this pandemic is occurring right now, precisely as we're covering end-of-life issues, bioethical issues at the end of human life, with so many thousands and thousands of deaths throughout the world, and sadly, predictably, more to come. We consider the greatest death and the most sad death of all times in our human history, which is the death of your Son Jesus on the cross, the only innocent one for our salvation. And also, according to our tradition, Lord, on this Holy Saturday, whereas his human body, his human nature laid silently dead on the tomb in respect of the Jewish Shabbat, the Sabbath, the day of rest. His divinity, our theology tells us, was very active indeed, possibly the greatest activity that our Lord Jesus did precisely after hanging on the cross, which is to go into the Sheol, the abode of the dead, to rise with him, the just and the unjust, who were waiting there since the beginning of creation and since the beginning of the creation of the human species, so that they may share with you that resurrection, Lord, and in anticipation of our own resurrection. Very briefly, in a few hours, we will be celebrating this Easter Vigil, which represents once again your resurrection and the possibility of resurrection for all of us. It calls to mind that whereas we are to die one day, sooner or later, we're also to rise with you and in you for all eternity. And therefore, we recognize that our home here on earth is temporary, but our home in heaven is eternal. And we thank you for that blessing. We ask humbly that this message be spread throughout the whole world, especially for those who have yet to receive this message, possibly 3/4 of the world's population, maybe more. Have mercy on us, Lord. Help us to understand this moment in our time, in our history, and to gain whatever it is that you have, the message that you have for us at this time. We continue to pray very especially for those who have died, those who will die today, their family and friends who are in mourning. We pray for the healthcare personnel who are putting their lives at risk, precisely to save the lives of total strangers, because of the commitment and the promise that they have made to their healthcare profession, for first responders, and all those who are involved in this crisis right now. Continue to keep us safe and our family and friends until we meet again in person. We ask this as we ask all things in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, so basically, well, what I have in mind, just a simple format. I will express a few thoughts at first, okay, and then open it up for comments, and we'll go from there. If you want to have paper and pencil at hand, just as a consummate teacher, I can't get it out of me, in case you want to take down a few notes or jot down some words that struck you, and if you want to comment on those later, or your own comments, of course, which are always welcome. All right, but again, to reiterate that I don't really expect a summary on this, because I just want it to flow naturally. And the first thing I want to say is that this really is it's an amazing, I mean, it's totally, we say in Spanish, fuera de serie. It's totally out of the ballpark, all right? Just amazing, incredible, what we are living right now throughout the world, to lesser or greater intensity in different regions of the world, which brings out a lot to reflect on. Between those who have access to whatever, including basic food and even just washing hand, water and soap, to those who don't, and from there forward. But I do want to mention that this is certainly it's kind of a textbook bioethical issue at the global level, because it has some basic biology for sure, but it also is begging the question of a bioethical analysis, all right? And as we speak, because it's also being recorded for the record, I want to say that I have been so humbled and enlightened by every cohort so far. You know that you are the fourth cohort in the program, so it's still a very fresh program. But always there's such variety and richness of backgrounds. We have with us anywhere from biologists to nurses to teachers to catechists, doctor, dentist, who very much can hopefully share, Dr. Jorge, about contamination, beginning with the throat and so forth. And we also have a businessman, Ivan, who can comment on the financial and economic impact of this, if you wish, and so forth. But we have quite an expertise, a range of expertise in our students, all right? And I always find that a great richness. So with that said, first, the biology. Basically, the basic biology of this, of course, is a viral infection, which has those two phases of the lytic and lysogenic phase. Not to worry about the details, but basically, I want to point out that scientifically, we don't even consider viruses that are so small and so tiny. We don't really consider them alive as such, okay, because they lack the two fundamental characteristics of all living organisms that we have observed here on Earth. And remember, one of my little sayings in the program is that this program is evidence-based. We do a bioethical analysis based on what we observe from nature, because nature teaches us, all right? And two basic processes that we observe in every living organism on Earth so far is metabolism and reproduction. All right, metabolism is another word for body functioning, and it goes down to the molecular level, the biochemical level of this elegant biochemistry of soup of reactions, of chain reactions and cascades that are occurring in every single cell of our body right now that forms the tissues and organs that keep us alive, all right, in a very concerted way. Organized, it's just amazing because the organization is so beautiful. down to the molecular level, and it counters this entropy, which is an increasing chaos throughout, or disorder throughout the rest of the universe. So life on Earth is a very unique phenomenon in the universe. And the other aspect of life is that every organism that we have discovered and observed on Earth, sooner or later, produces another one like itself of the same species, right? In fact, that's the biological definition of species that Mayer gave us, Ernst Mayr. And we see that viruses by themselves are unable to either metabolize or reproduce. And that's why they are really truly parasitic, because they're obligate parasitics in the sense that they need to sequester, they need to take over the metabolic process and the reproductive process of living cells. And that's also why viruses are so virulent, because the only way they can propagate is by infecting a cell. Essentially, a virus will be a DNA sequence, right? Or RNA. In fact, this one, the coronaviruses are retroviruses. You know, it's a group of retroviruses, which means that they have RNA instead of DNA. Recall what we covered last semester, which is a more delicate molecule, it's a more unstable molecule, all right? It tends to hairpin upon itself, loop out upon itself, but only in complementary regions. So it leaves loops and gaps, and that could be a reason why this one mutated. I also want to say that already the coronavirus strains have been in the human population for decades, maybe centuries, we don't know, but at least decades. I've been reading, and there may have been up to about 8 strains of coronavirus in the human population already, and they are flu-like symptoms. Essentially, runny nose, someone will develop a bit of a fever, maybe headache, which is a basic immune response, all right? Maybe some coughing and sneezing, but the vast majority of the population has been contaminated with some coronavirus at some point in history, and we get over it. And for the vast majority of people, we don't even realize that it's been a coronavirus instead of an influenza virus, because the symptoms are very different, very similar, all right? Influenza being the flu. But then all of a sudden, around December of last year, as far as people can tell, one of those strains mutated. May have been in a bat or some other mammal, in China somewhere, most likely. And it mutated to a new strain that is now identified as the SARS-CoV-19, all right? That's the actual name of the strain of the virus, this 9th strain. And it turns out that this strain, for some reason, is very virulent to the human population, to the human species, okay? Well, for some reason, because it's a new strain precisely, and we have never been exposed to it. And therefore, there's no immunity to it yet. It has to go through the population, the world population, at least once, so that we develop the immunity. And the 95% estimated of people who survive an infection, all right, I'll tell you how I get that number in a minute, will develop the immunity to some extent. Then there's still a lot of unknowns here on the biology, insofar as we don't know the rate of reinfection. What is the load, the minimal load, necessary load is the kind of the density, the concentration of viruses, the intensity of the viral infection, enough to develop the immunity, but not be overcome by it, right? So that if a reinfection occurs, that immunity is sufficient to give us just the flu-like symptoms and not kill the person who went through it once. So a lot of unknowns here, but basically at the biological level, it's a viral infection, all right? It's a viral infection that is novel, that is new, and therefore the human population needs to develop an immunity to it. In the meantime, this one in particular seems to be extremely virulent, And the type of virulence that it's producing is almost the body is killing itself by what is known as a inflammatory reaction, an overwhelming inflammatory reaction. Because I've heard, I was talking to another doctor who was in the program, was Dr. Martinez. Actually, he gives one of the talks in the healthcare course in the fall. And he was saying that apparently this virus includes a segment in its RNA. It also includes messenger RNA. Remember the mRNA that is made in the nucleus by the DNA and is sent out to the cytoplasm to generate the proteins necessary, in this case, for generating the cap or the capsule, the containment of the virus. So this virus apparently contains its own mRNA. And therefore, it can make more of itself, even more than just the regular virus would do in a cell, okay? And so when that cell lyses, the lytic phases, when the cell lyses, the infected cell, the whole cell, the number of viruses that it contains from maybe just one virus that infected that one cell is huge, exponentially larger than a normal viral infection. And each one of those viruses potentially can go to another host cell nearby, or if it gets in the circulatory system, anywhere in the body. And each one of those thousands of viruses will infect a new cell, a new host cell, all right, in our bodies, and generate another 1,000. So you can see it's an exponential curve, but it's not even, you know, it's 10 to the n or 8 to the n exponent. And that n could be thousands. And that's why you see the slopes are so steep, so vertical, all right, because that log phase is just skyrocketing. And what happens then, the body goes into an immune reaction, all right, producing inflammation, all the characteristics of inflammation, high fever, excess fluids, and certain cells, killer cells, and other cells of the immune system that start attacking and attacking our own tissues, our own organs, because it's too much of a load, of a viral load in our body, okay? And so that's the inflammatory reaction that becomes overwhelming. And that's what ends up killing the patient, okay? And so this thing it's a formidable enemy, all right, that we've never encountered at least in this century, because there's no record of anything like this before. The thing that got closest to it so far is that Spanish flu, all right? And even that was basically contained. It didn't, because in 1917 or 18, wherever it was, about a century ago, we just didn't have the airplanes that we have today. And so it didn't spread throughout the world like this one has. Okay, so that's where we're at, more or less, at the biology of it. But of course, we need to go forward because this is on the human population. And so we see that with the sophistication of technology today that we have, and even in medical technology, we're barely able and frankly quite unable to contain it when it starts spiking so much, because it overwhelms the healthcare system. And in some places in Europe, for example, the healthcare system itself collapses. There are no more beds, literally, in the hospitals, so the patients have to be put out in the street and so forth. And so that's what's happening. And therefore, it calls to mind all kinds of issues. How to supply, again, talking to some doctors here in the US, the supply chain. The way the system works here, apparently he was explaining, is that the hospitals and clinics don't stock that much. They don't stock that much because stocking technology and equipment and even things as gowns and gloves and masks en masse, it just sits there over long periods of time. It tends to degrade or whatever, and it could be lost. So they rely basically in the US, because the supply chain is so effective under normal circumstances, that they rely on what's called on-time delivery, all right? There's a commitment on the part of the companies that supply this material, even medical material, just like for us consumers, how we can track a package online, you know, and UPS or Amazon or whatever commits to delivering FedEx at particular time, day and time. The same with the medical supply chain. So these places basically rely on that on-time delivery, and therefore it caught them off guard. They didn't really have that amount of stock. And now everybody's scrambling for the necessary equipment, even just for the professionals to deal with the patients. So that's one bioethical issue there, you know, that goes up. Providentially, in the food chain, it's a little different. I was reading an article because in the food chain, supply chain, they do stock. And you think it's kind of paradoxical, at least to me, it's paradoxical that food that tends to be more perishable is more stocked, all right, to the point that we have up to 3 months of stock in different places of food, as opposed to medical equipment, which is non-perishable, typically, right, most of it, at least the safety equipment that is needed for treating patients, and then that's not stocked. At any rate, what I read about the food chain is that, sorry, my eye is itching and I don't want to scratch it, especially in front of you. I just let it itch. Okay, so yeah, the food supply chain, apparently it does move so fast. You know, we buy normally so much food throughout the United States and groceries and so forth, and grocery stores, that the grocery store holds usually about 3 weeks to a month stock, each grocery store in the back in the storage area. And then their local suppliers here in town, you know, whether it's State or Broward, wherever they're getting their bulk stocking of food, they hold about a month's worth of stock also, okay? And then one goes regional. I don't know if there's like a regional distribution for Florida or something like that, all right, to supply the local stocking areas. They also hold about 3 weeks to a month thing. And then finally, the fourth point on the chain, which is really the first one where it originates, is the point of origin of the food itself, whether it's a farm or wherever it is that the food is being produced and packaged. They usually hold about a month, 3 weeks to a month's supply also, to send out to the regions, and then the regions send it to the local stockers, and then the local stockers send it to the individual supermarkets. And so all that is in reserve, which can be moved out. So basically we have 2 to 3 months of food available even before the point of origin food producers start restocking at the beginning of the chain, okay? Very efficient, very interesting. I guess it also contributes to the economy because food is something that is consumed all the time, right? And so that stock constantly is moving forward out into our homes and being consumed. It's a one-way street. And that's why there was an initial kind of empty shelves, because there was some panic shopping at the very first. Typical happens also when we go into the warning phase of the hurricane. I've seen that. I've lived in Miami for about 50 years on and off, and I've always seen it. When we get to the warning of the hurricane, which is typically like 24 hours before the thing hits us, then everybody rushes to the stores and there's basically clean out the stores and you see the empty shelves. Well, that happened a little bit in a smaller scale throughout town and apparently throughout the nation when we first got the news of this, okay, and through media that really hyped it and so forth. And so, but then, I mean, I go to the supermarket periodically and I see shelves pretty much restocked. Of course, the sanitizers are going to be in high demand, and therefore they, as soon as they restock, they don't even sit on the shelf. People take them right off. What is a big puzzle to me, frankly, is the toilet paper. Even today, I heard in the news that there continues to be a lack of toilet paper generally throughout the nation, and even in Europe also. I don't know. That supply chain, I really don't understand why toilet paper of all things, you know, is very hard to find. but it's what it is. Okay. On the bioethics of it, I'm still in the process of trying to understand, really. It's very humbling. A mutation that occurs by chance, all right, because there's no brain in nature as such that we can tell, all right. There is a divine design, but certainly we're not fundamentalists to consider that this is a punishment of God, all right. I'll address that in a little bit, but it's a mutation, which, as we know, is one of the four fundamental forces of evolution. And so mutation in a virus is actually causing selection in the human species. Okay. Of course, that selection is only active when it occurs in the humans who are in their reproductive years, because, or possibly we could say before the reproductive years also, indirectly, you know, assuming that they would normally reach age of reproduction. But after reproduction, after the age of reproduction, then it's not causing selection, because if individuals die, then their vigor is not being passed on anyway. So right away we see very graphically, I mean, this is a study in evolution of the human also. It's amazing. We have become a lab animal for ourselves to study, not wanting it, of course, because consciously we would never do an experiment like this, okay? And I also want to address the conspiracy theory later if there's some time, some conspiracy theory, but this is occurring naturally. And normally we would never dream of doing an experiment like this. It's so abhorrent, and yet it's happening. So we can already glean information from it since it is happening, and we're trying to avoid it for sure, or contain it and mitigate and so forth. But since it is happening, we, frankly, in all humility, we can study the evolution of the human right now with this impact, because it's a global impact to greater or lesser extent in different populations. Consider this. Since for the purpose of evolution, you know, of what I'm talking about is the vigor. In other words, those humans who have a stronger, in principle, a stronger immune system and are able to overcome the virus. In other words, the 95% of those infected who heal. Then that 5% was selected out by the virus, okay? But the only 5% that count for the sake of natural selection is the 5% in reproductive age. So right away, straight away, there is, if you will, a natural discrimination between men and women. Because whereas women are cycling and have a set number of eggs that eventually run out chronologically, on average, between 40 and 50 years of age, all right, what we call menopause. Men don't. And so conceivably, the reproductive age of a man is until he dies, right? Whereas women, after menopause, if they are infected with the virus, that one, that infection doesn't count, if you will, for the purpose of natural selection. So there's a natural discrimination factor here of women against men more. So it will impact more the women population of reproductive years, okay? I'm pointing out facts that are coming up just from the biology of it. Now, how to interpret this, how to make some sense out of it. What is the Lord trying to tell us in this? Because the Lord is never out of our human history, okay? I don't know. I don't know. But what I do know so far, what I've come to conclude is that this is a very humbling thing for humanity. Very humbling. And so it does speak to me, at least, against arrogance and haughtiness, because I find it very symbolic, and I'll shut up in a few minutes, okay? I find it very symbolic that it's happening precisely during the Lenten season, and specifically, at least in the US, the 2 weeks of greatest intensity, the experts are telling us, are this week precisely, Holy Week, and next week, which is the first week of Easter, all right? The octave of Easter. I cannot think of more important 2 weeks in our Christianity than these 2 weeks. And what is this telling us? It's telling us that with all our sophisticated technology, and you've heard me make this analogy before, or pointed out that we have not one but 2 rovers, 2 jeeps essentially on Mars, okay, on another planet, going around now for years around the surface of that planet, filming and then digitalizing that film and sending us, or videoing I should say, sending us that digital signal. We here on Earth pick it up with radars and translate that digital signal into an image, colorized, so we can see the surface of Mars, all right, in color. It is bewildering, the technology, the capacity of technology that we have. And yet, we cannot overcome this virus. It has taken us to our knees, okay? Even the vaccine, which would be typically 9 months to a year out, by the time that vaccine is developed, there's expected a second wave, folks. I don't want to alarm you, but a second wave is expected, hopefully much milder than this one. But as soon as winter kicks in again in the Northern Hemisphere, because this virus does better in winter, we could expect a second wave of this, right? So what if this thing mutates again, and that vaccine now is worthless or not as effective? After a year of intensity, imagine how many labs are working on this throughout the world. So it's a very humbling thing, truly. Very humbling to realize that we're nothing. And this virus has finally forced us to think of our own nothingness, our own finitude, our own mortality, okay? That we may die within a few days from coughing and wheezing and just eventually asphyxiate to death. Very challenging, very humbling. So I just want to leave it there for now. Probably spoken too much, but let me open it up. And I don't know how people, of course, I think we should all speak one at a time, otherwise we're going to start getting feedback. I don't have any particular suggestion on how to do that.
Father?
The first one who speaks gets the floor.
Okay. Father?
Yes, please.
With all the bioethical issues that you brought up, is there a particular one that you want to discuss first? Is it just a generality? I mean, because there's a minimum 15 different bioethical issues with this virus and treatment of patients, and yes, you know, from a food industry, from a extinction, from a environmental. I mean, the sky's the limit on this. So I don't know if there's a particular pattern you want to
possibly. Well, I think also for the sake of time, also I would say maybe the healthcare one to me is the most concerning, because it involves human lives on both sides of the bed. You know, the patient inside the bed and all the healthcare workers who are around it, who for every one patient, there could be up to a dozen healthcare workers in different capacities who are exposed in their lives. Okay, so that's also exponential on the human level.
Right.
So maybe the healthcare one to me is the most urgent one, which has also many issues. So anyone want to comment?
Well, I'll put in my 2 cents, and I was discussing this with Shaban the other day.
Yeah.
So back home, back where I'm from, doctors are actually picking and choosing who gets equipment, and by default, who dies, which is very much against the Hippocratic Oath. And I mean, I've had doctors tell me that the Hippocratic Oath is, extinct, that if you really go word by word, everything that the Hippocratic Oath says, then there would be no surgeries, there would be, a gazillion things would be just, not followed. So it's really sad that if you are 60 or over, at least back home for me, you don't get equipment and you're going to die. And they're just basing it on the amount of decades that you lived, and that you're not going to be good for society based that, because you're in your 6th decade of life. And anyone under that, no, it's really sad. I mean, I shared a video with Siobhan, which I really, I mean, if she could translate it, it would be killer, because it's all in Spanish, obviously. I mean, it's really heartbreaking, and how doctors need to pick and choose. And what guidelines are they following? Is this from, from higher above? And by higher above, I mean government wise. It shouldn't be like this. Not to mention, I mean, I know no one's prepared for this. No one at all. There's what, tops 15 beds in an ICU. There's under 10 ventilators, respirators, et cetera, et cetera. But given all that, given the people that are being exposed left, right, and center without the proper PPE, given the fact that, now you have to truly play God and say, you get this and you don't get this, you're going to die and this one's going to be saved, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a humongous ethical issue going on with all of this.
Yeah, basically it's what is called triage, right? Triage. And good. I think maybe we can discuss a little bit of triage, because it's not new. It's been around for possibly for about a century. Siobhan probably knows much more about this than I do. Siobhan, you want to speak to that issue a little bit?
Well, triage essentially done during the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon's physician. Right. Basically, you look at what you can do, and triage, meaning 3. Those who can be saved, those who can't, and those who may require attention. So it's a system of evaluating, and it's incredibly subjective. We do it anytime. You look at a problem, you can fix this problem, you can't fix that problem has to wait. Yeah. So this is essentially what triage is managing your resources, trying to save those that you can, leaving those that are too badly hurt or injured to die because you can't offer them help, because by doing so, you compromise the people who could use the help.
Right. Yes. Let me say a couple of words of that, if I may. Thank you. Yes. Let me expand a little bit, because to me, triage truly is there anywhere where utilitarian ethics and principle ethics meet and shake hands and work together side by side. To me, it's in triage. All right, you're right. You reminded me that it was the Napoleonic physicians, doctors, field doctors that proposed that under war. Okay, so the first issue of triage is the circumstances, that the circumstances are extraordinary. For example, ICUs, ERs, emergency rooms, triage all the time, okay? People who walk in through the door and present, what do they present with, okay? They do an initial evaluation there. And the 3 groups are very, very important. Consider this, that's the minimal groups really that we can come up with regards to health. And the issue is this, in a war situation, okay, we're talking about soldiers who are injured. And back then, the injuries were more kind of graphic because they were going at each other with swords and things like that. So they were maimed, they were missing body parts and so forth. So the group that is lightly injured, let's say lightly injured in the sense that they can recover basically on their own if you leave them alone, or maybe they take care of themselves, of each other, but without any medical assistance, they can basically heal. They may not heal perfectly, they may limp for the rest of their lives and so forth, but they can heal. In other words, the medical assistance is not necessary for them to live, okay, to survive. So that group is left alone. The other group is the opposite end, is those who are so maimed, they're still alive, but barely alive, okay, they're dying. And that group is so maimed and hurt that even with medical intervention, it's unlikely that they'll be saved, or they may be saved for a while, but then they'll collapse. They will relapse, all right? And then there's a third group that with the here and now, in other words, with the medical equipment that we have, with the personnel that we have, under fire, with the enemy attacking, we can do something to save the life of this group. It may be a tiny group or it may be a large one. The numbers are secondary, Okay, but those are the three groups, very important because they are distinct, they're exclusive from each other. But that exclusivity, like Siobhan pointed out, is subjective to the person making the decision. All right. So what happens at that point? That professional, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, or a field technician, has to make that decision to the best of their ability in the here and now, hopefully praying to God for illumination, or not, because maybe Napoleon was quite secular, but has to make that decision to the best of their professional ability. And then move, because in the next minute, I'm going to lose the ones that I could have saved. And the decision is done and over, and then you move on that middle group, you see?
I remember first seeing that concept on MASH, the TV show MASH.
Yes, yes.
And how they did triage. And I know, not being from, I was a little girl when it first started, but
yeah, me
people
too.
with a medical background would know more about it, or if you've been in combat, you would know more about it. But
Yes.
the concept was very interesting because they were just deciding who needed to go into surgery first, and it never occurred to me they were deciding about lives. They were just deciding who had to go in now because they would die if they didn't. But I'm sure those decisions were made.
Yes.
Even though they, they're not publicly talked about or
yeah. Yeah, I found that program, even though it was sarcastic and it was made into a comedy and so forth, but I found it very insightful because truly they were presenting in kind of a light way what happens in field hospitals. And again, it's ironic. I mean, Pope Francis, since he started, he's been talking about the field hospital of the church, that we are in a spiritual field hospital precisely because of secular humanism is so expansive right now. People were just not turning to God because we were perhaps too comfortable. Mm-hmm. And he talked from the beginning of his papacy about the field hospital of the church, right? And the spiritual level. Anyway, so let's, what do you think then about triage and so forth, the ethics of it?
Well, Father, more importantly, because I do have the utilitarian background, or philosophy that I accept as probably the better, the good. It seems to me that a philosophy of absolutism, what you call principled, is truly difficult to utilize in a situation. If you took your principled, everybody should be saved. I mean, I don't hear that you go the triage, that under principled ethics, you can kind of make exceptions. That hasn't been because, no, that has been, I think, something you seem to point out frequently. An act is, maybe the circumstances, but the act is always intrinsically wrong. So do you have a duty to care in this philosophy? Yes. So if you do, and you don't do it, have you done something wrong? As opposed to a utilitarian philosophy says the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Yeah, in principle, we wouldn't see, that's a principle. That's the whole point, Siobhan. The principle of utilitarianism is a principle, it's the greatest good for the greatest people. And that is inviolable for utilitarians. So they're living by principle. The important thing is not to get hung up in somatics and lose the substance of the discussion, right? I wanted to clarify, if I may, for a moment, that it's not absolutism, but it's rather fundamental. I made the distinction precisely in this end-of-life issues that we distinguish between an absolute right to life and that life is not an absolute, but a fundamental value, okay? So I think that in practice, we do agree we're moving in the same direction. So a fundamental value, why save any human life, all right? Because the principle that life is precious, that human life is precious, but not absolute. If we were absolute, then we'd be stuck, really. We would, there would be no way out. And triage is done in Catholic hospitals all the time. Well, it isn't so much the triage, but if you want to go back to even to the euthanasia, now you have people who can't be saved, right? Because of the illness, they are gasping, they are dying. Yeah. As Ida was saying in the video, I mean, right. Absolutely horrendous. I think that's where your I'm trying
Well,
to think
that's the difference
walking
between,
along in the suffering and, you know, sort of the, I can't remember, I want to, it's the judge, the accompanying the suffering, I mean,
Yeah.
is really horrifying. At some point, why not say to these people, my God, you should not have to suffer anymore. You should not have to suffocate.
exactly, the difference between killing and allowing to die. It's bringing out all the principles that we've been talking
Right,
about.
but now
Killing
you're
or allowing
faced
to
with,
die. So
but
you
now
got,
you're faced with it it becomes no longer theoretical or just a 1 or 2 case. Now you could be talking, you know, 30, 40, 50 people that you are allowing to suffocate, that you are allowing them to drown in their own fluid. They cannot breathe. They are struggling. They are in pain. Do you still see euthanasia as an absolute evil then?
okay, so what do we do? So there's no more cure for that third group, right? The third group that is being abandoned, right? There's no more cure, right? Because they have a natural infection that is progressing and it's terminal. So they're dying, they're imminently dying. No more cure, but care always obligates, understood under normal circumstances. So we've said that if we devote any resources to them, we're denying those resources for the ones who can be saved. But let's push the argument a little further. In my mind, a utilitarian would say, well, instead of allowing them to drown in their own fluid, let's just euthanize them. Let's give them the lethal dosage. What I would say is, that's allotting resources already, so that's breaking the rule of triage, all right? Because now we're giving them some care and we're giving them some treatment, which is against triage, because by giving them that treatment, I cannot do 2 things at one time. By neglecting a patient that I could have saved when I went over here for a few minutes and took care of the group that I had abandoned.
Okay, Father, but triage is also the initial. It is not
Yes.
always an ongoing. I mean, it's a process. So the
Right.
initial triage was you identify. Now that you've identified it, I guess you could consider the triage the next step of triage. But once you've identified, those are the 3 groups that you look at.
Right.
Then you have the group. Then you have to decide what you do with each of the groups. It is no longer, at least I don't consider the triage process continues. I mean, it does in a way. I mean, it just, then you evaluate the care. It's the same thing as taking somebody off a ventilator who's not progressing to give it to the next person, which is what they've done in Italy, they've done in Spain, they've done in, you know, some places. They're talking about doing that.
Right. Right, but okay, so consider, you know, there's a time factor here that it's moving very fast. We're racing against the time. So let's assume that we could give some treatment to that third group that initially was to be abandoned. And the treatment would be, on the utilitarian side, would be euthanize them. On the principle side would be manage the pain, give them the dosage of morphine. So we're down forever, we're down to the dosage. The same morphine that could kill them by the overdose, we're saying just give them enough so that they don't suffer the suffocation, but they're gonna die anyway, okay?
Could they have assistance in dying? Could they ask for it then?
No.
Well, then again, it's not crossing that line in them killing themselves, all right? The physician-assisted suicide is what you're talking about, basically. But you see, it really does come down to dosage, and so.
Assisted in dying. I mean, I think this is where the
Yes.
discussion, but I just can't. I mean, maybe it's a difference without distinction. If I give you enough medicine to kill the pain and I understand dual effects, or I just say no, end the suffering, and kill you outright, it
would be a different dosage. No, I mean, and even you are more expert than me on this because you have been bedside for many years to patients. Doesn't it come down to dosage? It may be a titration issue. And does the healthcare personnel have enough time to do that without neglecting the other group that they could really, really save? I don't know. It's an open question to me.
Well, it depends on how many patients you have. You know, if you, I mean,
Yes.
theoretically, the ratio of patients, you know, in my unit was 2 ventilated patients. That's what you got. You know, now they're talking in some places of ventilated patients, you know, 4, 6, 8, 10 patients on a ventilator.
Exactly.
You can't give really any care of that. I mean, what have you. And if you had people dying and then trying to titrate doses, I mean, honestly, the resources that you would spend, I mean, yes, I mean, you know, 2 milligrams here, but it might not do it, and it, you know, 4, but 10 would certainly take care of, quote unquote, the problem.
Right.
You know, so, but I think the idea that, you know, under a circumstance like this pandemic, it is, you know, I think the philosophy of assistance in dying is not necessarily a bad thing.
Hey, Father, I want to say something, if possible.
Please, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. I think that in the end, this is a philosophical issue, and we are at both extremes of the issue here. We're not communicating well, and it's very hard to compromise in this, because it's either one thing or the other. In the end, we are denying the possibility of a transcendental impact in our life, even at the end of life, like miracles, for example. And when we care and we do our duty of caring at whatever extent we can, at least there's a possibility for a miracle, for a healing. And that is beyond our capacity. The moment that we play God and we decide to pull the plug just because we don't want to expend the effort, just the effort, we are denying that possibility. And for me, that is the problem.
God can create a miracle at any time. He can intercede. This is something we learned in the unit. Whatever we did, you know, to help a patient who was dying, and if there was nothing else we could do, God can always create a miracle. It's not necessarily the effort that somebody puts forth, because that's why it's a miracle. That's what God does.
Well, but the miracle would be just to continue feeding and to continue hydrating that patient. And if God can create that miracle in the mindset and the heart of the caregiver, fine. But if it doesn't happen, that's the end of the story.
But at what cost do you continue to hydrate, feed, and do for one patient?
That's the involvement of the dignity of that person. That's what it deserves. It's just a passive thing to do.
Well, if you do that with one and you can't then serve.
If you cannot do it, right. If you cannot do it, you just don't do it. If you don't have the oxygen, if you don't have the food, fine, you cannot do it. And that person maybe just need emotional contact until the very end. But you don't take the active role of playing God, of deciding, okay, you have to go, which is, for me, the physician-assisted suicide is just an excuse. It's, for me, it's a way to go around the fact that euthanasia is illegal. But the moment that we cross that bridge, of course, that those people that advocate for physician-assisted suicide, I'm going to do euthanasia. It's just watch the Dr. Kevorkian movie, and it's a slippery slope. Where does it end? You see the arrogance of the human beings, and then the priorities are going to change. So my opinion is exactly as Father said, principle versus utilitarianism. When you are in the utilitarian field, your range, your norms are going to shift with the economics, with the political current, or whatever is going on in culture. When you have principle, you're always going to strive for the maximum allowed. It's not an absolute. It's whatever is possible. It's a matter of effort. Like, I'm always going to strive for the best. And that is the basic norm. And that's just the way I think about it. And that's why it's a philosophical distinction between us. And it's very hard to strike a middle, a compromise on that, because we're on totally separate fields.
But I would say also, if I may, I want to include in the discussion the element of intention, which is subjective by definition, right? Because we all have an intention in our actions, okay? And the same action, the same exact action can be done either with good or bad intentions. So in the case of the healthcare worker on the triage or under the current circumstances of emergency, all right? the intention of that healthcare worker, be it the doctor or the nurse, typically more the nurse who is the one bedside, counts a lot. Because the same action that I'm doing, let's say specifically the morphine to sedate this particular patient who is gasping for air, all right? The same intention could be either to try to mitigate that sensation, to try to manage that pain and suffering, or to try to kill the patient. And the same intention, I mean, the same dosage on the same patient with the same symptoms may be an intention to try to help the patient die in peace or to try to kill the patient. And you see, that's the line where we're not called to go over, because we don't have the right. We just don't have the right. Some things are just intuitive or they're not intuitive. We can have the intention, and we should have the intention to help that patient to die in peace. So aiding dying truly in the word, yes, help him to die in peace, but not kill him. Because that's when we have crossed, the line to absolutize it, really. As I'm thinking about it, the utilitarian position is an absolutist position, because it leaves God out of the picture. I'm going to kill this patient, regardless of what God has in store for her or for him. Even regardless of what the patient is desiring, because the patient cannot communicate with me right now, they're gasping. So I have decided to kill this patient.
Okay, first of all, if a patient did communicate, then you would be honoring their wishes. Okay, so part of this is, again, if we take out the euthanasia part, because that may, hopefully never come to it, but you can, I think from what Ida was saying in the video and stuff, that's essentially what is being done at some level. But people have a right to decide when they want to die. And I see that as a utilitarian good, and that we can help people do that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me use a drastic example by analogy, and then we'll apply it to the current emergency situation. I am at a street corner, and there's a person next to me, and we have the red light. Okay. So we have the stop. I'm standing, I'm walking. I want to cross the street walking. There's another person next to me, all right? And we're just waiting for the light, the pedestrian to signal to turn green so we can walk. It's on red right now, meaning that there's traffic in front of us. There's fast traffic, there's heavy traffic, it's a big street, there's fast traffic. And somehow, the person next to me says, I'm going to go. I want to cross the street now, okay? And I'll say, no, look, there's traffic. Can you see the cars going through it? The person says, yes, but I want to go now. And I'm gonna say, well, okay, you know what? I am totally opposed to what you're gonna do, but I have to respect your opinion absolutely. You have absolute right to go, so go ahead. As opposed to what I would do, basically, I would grab the arm of that person and pull them off the corner, literally. That's what I would do at least that's what I say I would do, okay? If that person has really said, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna pull them off the corner. Similar would be the person who says to the psychiatrist, I'm gonna kill myself as soon as I come out of this session with you, and here's the gun to do it. That person has to be committed, right? So when the dying patient says to me, kill me, I'm going to say, I'm going to sedate you. So the effect is going to be the same. You're going to be sedated, okay? But I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to honor the killing, but I'm going to sedate you to the best of my ability. See the difference?
Well, what I see, I think it's a sort of sophisticated way of kind of cutting the difference. If I give you medication and I intend to get you sedated and I know you're going to die, that's the dual effect. Essentially, it's a way to assuage your conscience and to make it palatable, acceptable, but the action is still the same. I've given you the medication. I'm making you comfortable, but it's also allowing you to die. I understand secondary effects.
But it's allowing him to die, you
What
see. It's
happens
allowing
with
the
the
patient-
guy who pulls onto the street and he's going to go into traffic and he pulls you into traffic and then you die? Okay? It's the
So
same.
be it, I may take the risk, right? Okay,
You
I may take the risk.
Or you say that a person sadly has the right to do those things. People make mistakes. I don't think it's not a happy solution. It's not pleasant. But people who want to kill themselves, I mean, should have the right. Now, walking into traffic is not exactly you know, the idea of, I mean, that's such it's such an extreme that it you know, it becomes sort of absurd. And so it's hard to make an argument against extremes like that.
But it can happen, no? It can
Well,
happen.
of course
I mean,
it
it's
can
a
happen.
plausible reality, and it has happened. In fact, people have killed themselves that way, all right? Not to mention
Father.
the poor driver who hit that person, but they have on their conscience for the rest of their life.
Absolutely.
So
Father,
it's
the
just
cross of the
intention. It's the
matter.
intention not to kill the person, even if the person ends up dying with my best effort, all right? But that intention of killing versus allowing to die in peace. There's an intuition about it that I'm out of words to try to explain it any further.
Father, I think, again, as I mentioned before, I think it's a matter of the system of values that we have. If we think that we have the right to decide to take that life, how can we
Right.
change that in the people that make decisions? And on the other side, if we think that we don't have that right, that's the end of the story. I mean, two different actions on opposite directions are going to ensue beyond that. And I think that is very difficult to
It could be the same action. It
to
could be the
bridge it.
same action, but it is at the level of principle. Anyway, anyone else want to comment on this, please? Or anything that we've been talking about?
Well, I just don't think we should ever actively kill anybody. Again, it's about intent. And if you give someone
The intention.
sedation or painkiller and it's a dangerously close level to killing them, then it's a dangerously close level, but that's not what you're intending to do. You're intending to relieve their suffering, and you can relieve suffering without actively killing someone. I don't know how you can
Necessarily true,
explain
Maggie.
it better than that, but it's intent. Yeah, that's right.
There are plenty of instances where you relieve suffering and you actually kill somebody. I mean, that's the part that
What's
I
the
understand that,
intention?
but I'm not saying that's what we're aiming to do. We shouldn't aim to kill somebody. This injection is going to kill you. I'm giving you a lethal dose with the objective that you will die. No, we can't do that.
I'm going to give you something to alleviate the suffering, but I know you're going to die because your blood pressure can't take it.
Are you intending to kill them or relieve their suffering? Yeah, it's a fine line, but it's there. And once we cross it, who's to say who crosses it next and for what reason? The family decides when the patient dies. The doctors decide when the patient dies.
When you start deciding about,
You decide when the patient dies. You're opening the door to executing patients just for whatever reason. It's already happening in the world. It's probably happening here. It's just not. It's not.
Yeah, it's not. It happens in nursing homes many times.
Yeah.
It's just not reported. Yeah.
Well,
It's not
in this
documented.
particular case, if these people are having the symptoms, regardless if they tested positive or not, and they seek medical attention, I don't think they're going there for suicide, for euthanasia. I think they're going there to get treated. Whatever the outcome comes of that is what it comes of. But I mean, these people are getting put in, I guess, gurneys along hallways, not given food or water. Obviously, they're gonna gasp for air. They're alone because they're not allowed to be with their family members. So regardless if we're yay for this or nay for that, these people did not go to the hospital for, they went for a solution, a cure, mostly. So exactly, they went in for care. They didn't go in for, well, we're just gonna let, the virus take over. No, they don't. I know we don't have any idea how to truly treat this, how to resolve it. I get it. But nobody went in there for the intention of other than getting cured. And they're not seeing that. They're not seeing,
And
some of these people are getting not even triage. They're getting the bare minimum. You are this amount, it's not happening. We're doing everything else in our, based on our
Right.
equipment, the supplies of our doctors and nurses, because that's another thing, the shortage of that too. Based on what we have, if you're under this age, you're getting it. If you're over, well, done. I mean,
And so you're saying
that
they're
was
basically
my whole purpose
triaging
of
on
bringing it up.
age.
I'm sorry?
You're saying basically they're triaging on age. To me,
Yes.
that's where the system is getting overwhelmed. Then we have to go hospital by hospital, of course, because maybe not every hospital is doing that. But whatever system is doing it, I would say that they have reached the breaking point. They're getting overwhelmed, and short of putting the patients out on the street, okay, they're doing the best possible under the drastic circumstances of putting beds out in the hallways and so forth.
Well, not just out in the hallways. They're basically setting up, I mean, they were going to John the Divine as a hospital. They're using the Javits Center. They're using the Miami Beach Convention
Right.
Center
Mhm.
if we run out of beds.
Yeah, those
The
are
fact
basically
of the matter
field
is-
hospitals, right?
Well, the field hospitals, but who's going to staff them? And when you don't have the equipment, who do
Right.
you decide gets it? Is it first come, first serve? If
Right.
you were there yesterday and you were sick, but tomorrow, and depending on who the person is, I
Yeah.
mean, some people might say, that you need to look at how you are deciding who people are.
Yeah.
This is something I wanted to bring up in the beginning when you first suggested the triage. I've mentioned this many times, depending on where you sit at the table is where you stand on an issue. If you are some of the powerful, if you are the rich, if you have access, you will get theoretically the supplies you need. It is other people who will not.
Right.
And how do we decide what's necessary in society? Do we want
Exactly.
philosophers? Do we want artists? Do we want priests or teachers? Or do we want an engineer? Or frankly, do we want a garbage man who can actually pick up the trash so we can function? How do we decide those things? Who gets to make the decision?
Exactly.
Right now, the rich and powerful, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly rich.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's always
very
been this way, basically. And so perhaps one takeaway message from this is we shall also be judged on that, right? So how do we change that? How do we change that? And especially, how do we change it on people who don't necessarily have our same value system? That's why, to me, the greatest message so far that I've been able to get from this is a conversion. A conversion really that is humbling us all. And look, it's not respecting the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, all right? The Prime Minister of the UK. Here he's out of ICU now, but he almost lost it and he's still not out of the woods. And talk about rich, famous, white, male,
That's all the one targeted by the virus. That's the irony of it.
Yeah.
The
Well,
balancing of nature.
If you read the statistics that that are at least going on in South Florida, the ones that are dying from this are lower socioeconomic African Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really appalling because we saw it last night. If you are slightly better than that level of society and economics, and if you're just a tiny bit not considered a darker color, even if you were darker Latin, you would get more of a fighting chance than if you were considered full-on Black in this country. I mean, it's I don't know, it's alarming, it's horrifying, regardless of how you slice it. I mean, if you're there to get cured, you're there to get cured. I mean, triage, I get the whole triage, but nobody's going in there thinking, I'm not going to get service, regardless of how much we know or don't know how to cure it. I mean, basic stuff is needed, and they're not getting this. And it's very horrifying, because if you notice, everybody that's tested positive and is suffering from Congress all the way down to whatever state level or all of the local government, they're doing hunky-dory fine, to the point that these people are actually broadcasting messages and actually doing their jobs from their home. But I mean, how about the other people? You don't know what they're,
right.
I don't know. You don't know what they're good for. I mean, they're still able to contribute to society, and just, this black and white, whatever it is that you do right now, whatever age you are, to me, just doesn't cut it.
Well, there's a certain ageism. Again,
Yeah, oh, without a doubt.
if you suggested that a certain age, well, you might say a 20-year-old with no life experience really should not be more valuable than a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old who does have life experience, who has knowledge, who has talents that have not been developed. I mean, you could very seriously make the argument, and an editorial a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times actually made that point, that how do we decide who is valuable in our society? More importantly, it's who's getting to decide that. And again, I say it's people who are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly rich. And until we accept that and we look at that and realize, you know, that we've written out women, we've written out poor people, we've written out of, you know, people who are marginalized. We will still have a society that allows, you know, rich white men to make these decisions essentially.
No, without a doubt, because I mean, my goal in life, which I never got to, was to become a doctor. But I would definitely be a very, very poor doctor because I would save everybody. I don't care how much you don't, whatever lack of knowledge you have because of your age or too much knowledge, or I don't care if you're, you know, living under a bridge somewhere, you know, because of whatever you've done. I mean, I would just take care of everybody. I would definitely be a very poor doctor, and I would probably get fired out of every hospital I work at because, I mean, I would just care for everybody.
Less doctor, like St. Luke.
You would be a very good doctor.
Dr. Jorge, want to comment anything as a doctor?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, everybody has their own opinion on that, but, you know, for us, it's a matter of prudence, because I think that, you know, if everybody goes home, probably it's going to be over soon. But, you know, many people are out there, you know, doing their own business. And that basically, you know, I think, spreading the problem. And they said, you know, the system is overwhelmed, and I don't think we're prepared for this. If more people get infected, you know, it's going to be a matter of choosing, you know, who lives and who dies, depending on, you know, available beds or respirators. So for us, you know, this is going to be the third week that we're home because, you know, for us, you know, we treat everybody, you know, as they are infected, because before we had, you know, HIV and hepatitis C, which, you know, is very infectious, but this is more than that, and we cannot control that, and you don't know who's infected and who's not. So for us, you know, the main thing, you know, is prevention, and that's why, you know, we close the office, and basically we're just seeing emergencies on medication basis, because we are not doing any treatments, because that's something we cannot control unless we have, you know, a hazmat suit or something like that. But, you know, it's very difficult even doing that, you know. So that's why we're home right now. And regarding the virus, you know, there's something strange about that. And it may be that it might be natural, but you know, look like, you know, it's being developed. In China, where everything started, you know, Wuhan, they had a P4 lab there. Looks like, you know, that virus came out from a lab. And besides that, you know, we haven't been getting the whole story from them. Every day, you know, is a new cover-up over there. The last statement was that, you know, everything was fine and nobody's getting infected. But, you know, you start seeing, you know, different videos leak out from the system that, you know, they're saying that, you know, people are discharged from the hospitals, still being infected. And they're covering up, you know, the numbers. And we have this pandemic because, you know, they didn't say, you know, what was going on.
Right.
And this started, you know, early November, and also, you know, the World Health Organization didn't say anything, and they are kind of, you know, with the Chinese saying the same thing. But in any case, I don't know if we can control this. I think the only way to do it is just, at this moment, stay away from that, stay at home,
Yeah.
and just wait for that to pass.
So it's going to be more like a survival of the sickest?
That's what I think.
Definitely. No, we are actually experimenting, in my opinion, a case of natural selection on the human population like never before, at least in recorded time. But I wanted to address something that Doctor said for a moment. I mentioned it at the very beginning, just in passing. In fact, one of the conspiracy theories, if you will, was that it was engineered as opposed to a natural mutation. And then I think it's been 2 weeks now that an article appeared in Nature Medicine, all right, where they finally sequenced the RNA. And it turns out that it is a natural mutation, okay, because they were testing that theory to see if this was actually engineered or not. And it's true what you mentioned. I looked it up. China did build a P4 lab, which is the highest level of containment in Wuhan, precisely in 2015. All right, so very recently. Apparently, it's their first P4 lab, and it's right there. So there was the original people were connecting these dots, and that they were blaming the fish in the market, that it had been the people in the lab. And either it escaped or was released on purpose to test out the virulence as a bioweapon. However, as a bioweapon, it doesn't really kill all the people. It's indiscriminate. So their own people are also getting killed, unless it was so nefarious that they wanted to exterminate their own people. If it had been engineered, for example, as a bioweapon, you would think that they would have immunized their own people first and then spread it elsewhere instead of starting the infection right there. But anyway, the sequence was pretty definite to put that argument or that theory to rest, in the sense that it is a natural sequence and it just has a mutation in it that happens to be very virulent. But you're right, more reports seem to be coming out that the Chinese knew about it early on, maybe as early as November, and didn't say anything, either because they didn't realize what they had on their hands or they wanted to cover up. In fact, I guess there was a little video, the first doctor who alerted the world to this ended up dying from it in a hospital, right? And apparently the World Health Organization was also in the know from the start, because they monitor these things throughout the world, but didn't say anything either. So be that as it may, okay, what we have now is the reality of this pandemic. So it could be that the Chinese were to blame originally, at least for not sounding the alarm. And we could have done something better. Hindsight is always 20/20, as we say, right? But the fact is that we have it now, and their people are dying as much as our people. So that's what we have to deal with. And the fact that their people are dying at the same rate. Oh, I mentioned that 95%. I'm just taking numbers. 2 numbers is what we need for that. We need the number of deaths in the numerator and divided by the number of cases that are known so far in the denominator, and then multiply that times 100. That gives us the percentage, the rate of death or survival. Okay. Now, about those 2 numbers, they're to be treated differently, because the number of deaths is a known number. In other words, the people who are actually dying are being counted, right? So that's a more accurate number. The number of infected is a more inaccurate number. The denominator is, we can say in confidence, that it's underestimated, because not everyone who is infected is known. Okay, so the ratio that we get, therefore, is kind of an upper limit percentage, in my interpretation. We can say up to 5% of the infected people are dying. But it could be much less because there could be many more infected people contributing to the denominator, which will make the fraction even smaller. You follow? So I find optimism in that, in just in the sense that the vast majority of people, even with the upper limit of the rate, are surviving, are coming out of the infection alive, all right? Hopefully now my question as a follow-up would be, what is the reinfection rate, which is what I started with, because we have to brace ourselves for a possible, very likely second wave in about 9 months' time, in the dead of winter.
Or when it hits other excessively populated areas that haven't had the hardest hit yet. So when it reaches full-blown into India, what are the numbers going to be there?
Yes, yes, thank you, because that also brings up the geography of it, which is so predictable. I mean, at this point, we've seen a pattern. That it's a very, very obvious pattern in China, meaning Asia, moved westward to Europe, beginning Italy, and then Spain, the other end of the peninsula of the European continent. Then it jumped overseas, which is unique for this century, right? To have that jump, precisely because of flights, because of airplanes, into the big ports of flights. New York, I've been through Kennedy Airport, waited hours and hours for flights there over decades. And it's a major hub. And there's the new focus then in the North America. If we look at the other side of the world, moving eastward from Asia, from China, into the West Coast, precisely the two big hubs there are Seattle, Washington, and California, right? To this day, full of Oriental people, okay? And then moving in from both coasts to the US. So it's definitely a density issue.
Well, Father, it's also an issue of talking about after the Chinese Lunar New Year, people going back to Italy because of the labor, because it's cheap labor that the Chinese return to Milan and North Italy.
Yes.
So one of the reasons they think Detroit is hit, because Detroit there's a major, I don't know which airlines it is, actually uses Detroit as a hub that came from China. So that's one of the reasons they think Detroit is being so badly, or Michigan is now, I believe it's probably the 4th or 5th state that's having some issues. New Orleans, because of, 1 million people at Mardi Gras, but not just that. And I think some of the numbers are going to show that a large portion of the virus actually came from Europe, not from China. Well, that it originated in China, but part of the spread is due to the transmission and the travel from Europe to the United States, at least on the East Coast.
Yeah, right. Yes. And so then it's only a matter of time until it moves south, right into the Southern Hemisphere, which they're going into winter now, okay? And the Southern Hemisphere, so we can expect the Latin America, Africa, Asia, and India, which is a powder keg right now, precisely because of the high density of the population there. Absolutely, yeah.
We also need to check for the numbers out of Brazil with all the favelas and all the,
Yes. So again, the socioeconomic impact, right? Absolutely, we cannot get away with it. And that is a global conscience, again, this issue of the socioeconomic. I mean, the gospel has been talking about this for 2,000 years, and even before in the Old Testament, for sure. And we have yet to take care of this issue, right? Yeah. So in that sense, I guess we are, like the prince said in the Merchant of Venice, right? We are all punished. We are all to blame, one way or another. Yeah. It's not back to business as usual, and I hope that we can learn something out of this.
Father, I've heard something, I've read a couple articles that mentioned this Dr. Fauci. I don't know if that's the way you say his name.
Fauci, yes, the doctor for the White House.
Where he has, and maybe not only him, there's probably others, have said something about when the numbers start to fall, that perhaps they would be thinking of issuing some kind of certification that you would be immune because you've already had it to the people who are immune. And you've already had it or whatever.
Right.
And that, to me, that's a bioethical concern, because that's the a segregating of part of the population of like, well, you can't come back to work because you're one of them. And how do, I don't even know where to go with that. I mean, that's the idea of being identified as having an illness or not. You know, I mean,
Right.
where?
Well, again, I had not heard about the certification, but kind of thinking out loud here, what first comes to mind is also the economy, because I mean, consider this, if the American economy collapses, it's not just us, okay? It's the whole world, because so many people do depend on the American economy to keep things moving. So definitely there's a big concern on the part of the government to get the economy back rolling again. All right, and that's an ethical responsibility.
But they can't do that until there's massive testing, and that's one of the issues that Dr. Fauci and others are talking about. The fact of the matter is that you would be allowed to go back to work because they knew that either you had the disease and that you've already gotten the immunity to it. We do segregate people all the time. People who have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis are tracked. We track people with social diseases and do contact tracing. So it's not really an unusual concept. The fact of the matter is it would basically, but you can't do it until there's enough testing that you can identify people. You certainly do not want people going back into the workforce who can infect other people. Right. So it would be basically, you know, having your blood test. I mean, could you be forced to do it? I don't know. That's a different issue, Maggie. But if, you know, if the idea is that you can work, you certainly want people who are not infecting to be out there. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Big social concerns.
People being alienated who are, you know, it's like the old age of leprosy, you know, stay away because we might catch it. I understand that, but I'm not sure where to go with that because it's a very
people on my Nextdoor app were suggesting that people's houses be marked that they have the COVID virus, sort of like a Scarlet A or the yellow star, you know, that Jews had to wear. I mean, this is sort of, you know, one of the things they talk about in China with them wearing the mask, that everybody initially in this country, the only people who wore masks were the people who are afraid or may have had it. In China, everybody wears it, so it takes the stigma away. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's a virus and, you know, it's going to go through the population. It apparently is not discriminating, unlike a lot of us. So, you know, but the idea of some sort of certificate or some sort of testing seems to me to be something that we can do. Hospitals can do the same thing with their employees when they tell you if you don't get the flu vaccine. You actually have to wear a mask at some hospitals if you have not been vaccinated, and employees have been disciplined. So it's not a concept that's truly new or novel here. It's just how it's applied or what you think in terms of public health. And again, the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Yeah. Okay. So we're just at the beginning of the analysis of this. Of course, there's so much more. And I'm looking at the clock now. We've been at it for about an hour, almost an hour and 45 minutes almost. I, for one, need to keep going now. I have other commitments here, but I don't know. Anyone else want to share anything else?
Happy Easter to everybody.
Yeah, happy Easter.
Very blessed.
Father?
Happy Easter.
Oh, jeez.
Happy Easter.
Thank you, Marie. Happy Easter to everyone.
Happy Easter, everyone.
Let's. I want to perhaps just end with reminding all of us that we are people of hope, especially, right? And I make a distinction between faith and hope, even though many times in the Gospels and the New Testament they're kind of indistinguishable, but we all have faith in something, whether it's God, money, power, sex, prestige, my car, my bank account. We all have faith in something or someone. But hope is a little different because if we don't have hope, then we despair, right? And perhaps some people, maybe around us, near us, may be despairing. So I think this is very much a time for hope, to know that ultimately we are created for eternal life. This season brings it to mind. And so we need to remind ourselves and remind others that we are certainly people of hope, right? And we want to share that with those who surround us, maybe a little prayer, maybe calling someone whom we haven't called in a while, making contact, just asking how they are, okay, could go a long ways at this time. So with that, we want to thank you, Lord, again, for certainly not for wishing us this pandemic, but for, yes, allowing it to happen, like you have allowed to happen many things in our lives that are not necessarily what we want, but perhaps it's what we need. May we learn from it, may we glean from it, that we need to change some of our attitudes, some of our actions, some of our beliefs, right? Especially toward those who are hurting the most right now. And to reaffirm our love for you, our trust in you, that you are with us. And no matter what, that you walk with us and that you will see us through one way or another. Take the opportunity to thank all of you for connecting. I'm very, very happy that we had 100% participation. And just impart my blessing, especially as we approach the Easter Vigil and the Easter season for 7 weeks now, all right? Full number of faith, hope, and charity. The good Lord bless you and your families. Stay safe and try to help others do the same. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Father, happy.
Okay, thanks again. Looking forward to seeing you in person soon, God willing.
Amen.
Thank you. God
Bye.
bless.
Bye. God bless.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Thank you.
Bye.
How do I get out of here?